Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Dave White, Deputy Director of the ASU Global Institute of Sustainability and Innovation. Our institute discusses a range of environmental, social, and economic topics at these occasional Sustainability Series events. But today's event is the first in a series of virtual talks in partnership with Island Press, a nonprofit book publisher that shines a spotlight on crucial issues and focuses attention on sustainable solutions. In addition to our honored guest, Professor Jennie C. Stephens, we'll be welcoming 4 additional Island Press authors who have books coming out this fall. We thank Jen Hawes, Partnership Manager for Island Press, for bringing us these thought leaders whose work lies at the intersection of climate change, housing, energy transition, and activism. It is now my pleasure to introduce Chris Mays. Chris is Professor of Practice in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society in the new College of Global Futures, as well as Director of ASU's Utility of the Future Center. You can add honorable to Chris's titles, as she served on the Arizona Corporation Commission from 2003 to 2010 and is considered the mother of Arizona's renewable energy standard. Chris, welcome.
Thanks, Dave. I'm so thrilled to be here today and to be your moderator, and welcome our speaker. Jennie Stephens directs the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs and is the Dean's Professor of Sustainability, Science, and Policy at Northeastern University in Boston. She also directs the Strategic Research Collaborations at Northeastern's Global Resilience Institute and is affiliated with the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program, the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering there, and the Department of Culture, Societies, and Global Studies. Her research, teaching, and community engagement integrates social justice, feminist, and anti-racist perspectives into climate and energy resilience, social and political aspects of renewable energy transition, reducing reliance on fossil fuels, energy democracy, gender and energy and climate and energy justice. Dr. Stephens' transdisciplinary approach integrates innovations in social science and public policy with science and engineering to promote social justice, reduce inequalities, and redistribute power, whether it's electric power, economic power, or political power. She is here today, and we are super excited about this, to talk about her new book with Island Press entitled Diversifying Power: Why We Need Antiracist Feminist Leadership on Climate and Energy. And I will tell you, you got to go buy this book. Go grab this book. It's fantastic. I've been reading it this week, so I'm looking forward to the conversation. As a reminder, before we begin, we are going to have a Q&A session, so put your questions into the chat Q&A feature, and we will get to as many as we possibly can. So Jennie, take it away.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Dave, and thank you to Island Press and ASU for inviting me to this, hosting me for this discussion. I'm hoping this book really tries to be optimistic about and elevate the stories of leaders that many of us may not know about, some of them we may know about, who are really acknowledging and connecting the climate and energy crises that we face with the other crises that are also we are also facing right now very explicitly, including economic crisis, health crisis, racial justice crisis, and structural racism, and all kinds of other challenges that we're currently facing, particularly during this pandemic. So I welcome the opportunity to have this discussion, and thank you for having me. I think I will start by acknowledging one of the things. I've worked in climate and energy for over 20 years now, and increasingly I have been frustrated with the lack of effectiveness of our policies and our action. And what I have learned, and I have a science and engineering background, is that we have not been investing enough. We've been investing a lot in technological innovation, not enough in social innovation, which allows us to center social justice and consider social change. And so really that is part of the message, and what that I'm trying to do with this book is emphasize the possibilities of engaging more explicitly on social innovation. Let me see here, sorry, just don't seem to be able to move the slide. Oh, here we go. So just to give you a sense of, this is a non-academic book. It's a publicly accessible book that is a synthesis of a lot of ideas and people that I've talked to and met and organizations that I'm familiar with. So I wanted to just give you a sense of where I'm coming from writing this book. I was first born in Ireland. So I moved to the United States when I was 8. I studied first environmental science and policy with a focus on water, then had a technical PhD and master's, thinking about water, soil, and carbon. And that led back to my policy interests, where I did postdoctoral work focusing on energy technology innovation, where I worked with a lot of energy experts, mostly with the technical framing. And then I was a professor at Clark University, the University of Vermont, and now I am at Northeastern, where I've been for the past 4 years. And I mention this in part just to share kind of my background and the intersection of social science and technological science and engineering, because it's critical to the points that I'm making. So I really propose that the climate crisis is a crisis in leadership, and that climate justice is racial justice, and they're intricately connected. So I want to elevate and explain what I mean by that. Climate isolationism is the phrase that I have coined to kind of demonstrate and characterize the narrow technocratic lens by which we have been engaging on climate discourse and focusing a lot of our climate policy, which is really technocratic, focused on greenhouse gas emission reductions, decarbonization, potentially carbon pricing mechanisms. All of this is, technical lens, and it's based on kind of certain assumptions about domination and control and how things work. And we're really missing opportunities for improving the human condition because we haven't been focusing enough on social change, social justice, and social innovation. So an alternative lens that I propose is energy democracy, which is acknowledging that we need to move away from a fossil fuel-based system to an renewable-based society. And when we do that, that's actually a big shift. And it's not just about the technology, but it's also about reconfiguring ownership, power, and who is benefiting and profiting, and who's included and who's excluded from our energy systems. So when we move toward a renewable-based system, and a renewable-based future isn't just wind and solar, there could be locally appropriate mix. If you're on the coast, you could have wind and wave and tidal, as well as offshore wind. If you're inland, you could have geothermal, as well as wind and solar and hydro of different kinds. And you could really have local, regionally appropriate, heterogeneous mix of renewable sources. And the important thing to remember is that the reason renewables are so powerful is once you've figured out a way to leverage and harness that energy, it's perpetual, it's abundant, and it's free. So really moving toward a renewable-based society is much bigger than just a technological switch. It really is about redistributing power, literally and figuratively. So if you embrace that lens, you can see how we need broad investments in people and communities. And as we invest in energy, in our energy system, we can base that on social justice and human dignity and invest in what people need, what our families need and communities need, and we can leverage the urgency of the climate crisis for a bigger social transformation. So I explain that by connecting it with the economic injustice of what has been happening, particularly in the United States. This has been happening around the world, but particularly in the United States, with this widening income and wealth gap. Many of us are sort of familiar with this, but many don't really realize how bad it has gotten just in the past few decades. And here, this figure here shows the share of national income with the top 1% has gone from about 10% to 20%, and the lower 50% has declined about the same magnitude. And with wealth, the gap is even wider, and this is continuing until we have some big transformative change. And the reason it's continuing, it's not an accident. It's actually very intentional, this concentration of wealth and power. And it's by you know, the 1%, or a lot of people are now considering the polluter elite, who are shareholders, fossil fuel interests, rich individuals and organizations that have been profiting from our fossil fuel system. They really have been actively investing to strategically resist a transformation toward a renewable-based society. So some of the strategies they've been investing in for decades is a misinformation campaign to deny climate science. Many of us are quite well aware of how effective that has been. But they've also been undermining public trust in government, reducing protections for us that the government provides, and minimizing worker protections and worker rights and unions. And really, there's been a corporate shift over these few decades so that corporations aren't prioritizing their workers and their employees. Instead, they are prioritizing shareholder interests. So what is really needed to, I think, to transform our economic system and our energy system is anti-racist feminist leadership. And what I mean by that is leadership that is based on collaboration, inclusivity, and participation. The Squad are 4 young congresswomen who have come onto the national scene just in the past couple of years, and they have demonstrated anti-racist feminist leadership and in very effective ways, and shown how practical perspective on what people need and calling out the 1% and the traditional way of doing things as inadequate and unacceptable, it can be so powerful. And obviously that group has been known as the Squad, and they've been, you know, targets of racist and misogynistic attacks, and they persist and have been really powerful in what they have been able to accomplish in terms of changing the discourse. And they're really focused, and this kind of leadership is focused on distributing wealth and power, prioritizing investments in communities and workers' rights, reducing inequities and disparities by centering social justice and racial justice in all of our policies, and then leveraging the transformation by linking these problems, acknowledging that none of our problems are in isolation, and that we really have opportunities when we connect them. And obviously that is in contrast to patriarchal conventional leadership that's based on domination and control, and really exclusion, very intentional exclusion of many people. And it's that exclusion is to concentrate wealth and power and prioritize the investments to maximize corporate profits, and all of that exacerbates inequities in racial and gender disparities. And one of the things, the key strategy of the conventional leadership is to deny the problems that we have. So not only people denying that we have a climate crisis, but they're also now denying that we have an economic crisis, denying even the pandemic, that we have a healthcare access crisis, and denying that we have structural racism and racial injustice crisis. So what I do in the book is really elevate the stories of inspiring, motivating leaders who are doing amazing things. And so I'll quickly just kind of go through a few of the examples of people who are really having a big impact, and but don't always get the recognition that they deserve. Jackie Patterson of the NAACP heads up their Environmental and Climate Justice Program, and she and her team put together a very robust program and this report called Fossil Fueled Foolery that explicitly calls out the fossil fuel industry and demonstrates how the fossil fuel interests have manipulated and co-opted Black communities around the country, oftentimes giving them money in response or some kind of financial support in response for in return for support for fossil fuel investments, and other strategies, including voter suppression and you know, reducing the power of our democracy in multiple ways. Other leaders that have been resisting the polluter elite include Jasmine Banks, and many of us are familiar with the Koch brothers and their influence in terms of the fossil fuel interests and their strategies of influencing our educational systems and our court systems and our criminal justice system. So Uncoke My Campus is an organization that calls out and holds those, reveals those influences in an attempt to reduce the influence that they've had. Maura Healey is an example of a leader here in Massachusetts who has taken on, she's the Attorney General here, and she has taken on ExxonMobil directly by lawsuits accusing them of greenwashing and being perpetuating unfair information about fossil fuels. So I want to connect then with leaders who are really connecting climate and energy with jobs and economic justice. Rashini Prakash is one of the leaders of and founders of the Sunrise Movement, and she has really been phenomenal in building this youth movement that is really pulling collective, collaborative leadership and really motivating, and has had a huge impact in getting the Green New Deal on the national agenda. And obviously Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is another key leader, one of the members of the squad, who has been calling out and connecting economic justice issues and the guaranteed jobs with the Green New Deal. We also have leaders who are particularly focusing on workforce training, and with all the new jobs being created with renewable energy transformation, making sure that people are trained, communities and workers who've been excluded from the energy sector previously, or excluded from some of the subsidies and benefits that have been allocated for renewable energy, making sure that those individuals and communities have access to jobs. So Grid Alternatives is a national organization that does solar installation with workforce training. Esteban Kelly is the leader of the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives that connects the notion of cooperative with renewable energy. And Rowena Altmos is a leader here in Boston with a small organization called All In Energy that's connecting energy efficiency and weatherization jobs with low-income communities that have been disproportionately excluded from getting the benefits of energy efficiency investments. So all of these people are focusing on the precarity, resisting the precarity of that we have become accustomed to in this country, that's become so widespread, and really reclaiming the possibilities and the potential of public investment and restructuring for more inclusive prosperity. The next chapter of my book focuses on leaders who are connecting climate and energy with health, well-being, and nutritious food for all. Robert Bullard, often known as the father of environmental justice, is among the first to do research that demonstrated how Black communities were being disproportionately impacted on their health from fossil fuel and other facilities, industrial facilities. Mildred McLean, the Harambee House Citizens for Environmental Justice, is well known for saying, you know, we are sick and tired of being sick and tired, and elevating not just the exposures that Black communities have, but also their lack of access to healthcare. Gina McCarthy has been a leader that is, who's for decades now been elevating the value of connecting climate with health, and really pointing to the connections. She's currently the head of the NRDC, but she was previously Obama's EPA administrator. And she has been, at this point, many communities and cities have actually declared the climate crisis a public health emergency. So that has been shifting. Julian Hishaw is a lawyer and advocate for Black farmers. Mustafa Santiago Ali is an activist who has been standing up for Black communities and pointing out the disparities there with Black communities in terms of climate impacts as well as climate mitigation strategies. Dorcetta Taylor of University of Michigan is the researcher who first pointed out how the whiteness of the environmental movement in the United States and how that has led to a specific focus within the environmental community that has not been inclusive. And I mentioned here Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, when we talk about health, because she has also demonstrated how New Zealand right now is being held up as one of the countries that has been the most effective in managing the coronavirus. And Taiwan, Denmark, and Germany, other countries led by women, have also been more effective. And a lot of the, it seems like the characteristics of this leadership that has led to more effective responses is, looking at the evidence, taking strong early measures, and then communicating with empathy and compassion that not only is to do this, take these measures for your own health and for the health of your family, but the collective health of the community and the country as a whole. With regard to transportation, we have some really inspiring leaders who have changed the transportation discourse. Representative Ayanna Presley, who is actually my representative here in Massachusetts, she is head of the Transportation Caucus, and she has always centered transit justice in her priorities. And also here in Boston, Michelle Wu is a Boston City Councilor who has just announced she'll be running for mayor here in Boston, and she just released her Green New Deal for Boston, and it includes free public transportation, which in our conventional sense is, people say that's impossible. How are we going to afford free public transportation? But if you have a social justice lens and priority, you can see how providing free public transportation opens up opportunities for communities and for workers to have broadened opportunities for economic equity, and that it really also, if you think about the price of getting on the bus or the subway, it's a very regressive mechanism, because it's much more expensive and a big expense for families and individuals on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. So I also mentioned here Greta Thunberg, because she obviously has elevated the transportation connections with her innovative approach to getting over to North America and back last year when she sailed across the Atlantic rather than taking an airplane. So I also want to just emphasize housing and the connections with climate, energy, and housing. Representative Ilhan Omar, another member of the squad, has been very outspoken in the need for public housing, investments in public housing. And now with the pandemic, we have a real housing insecurity crisis, and it's getting worse, as many of us are very much aware. And there are leaders like in Oakland, Moms for Housing is a group of 4 mothers who were homeless and started living in a vacant house in Oakland, and they were evicted using a full military style tanks and guns in the middle of the night, moving them out of the house that they were living in, and they used that as an opportunity to leverage the disparities and inequities of housing, particularly thinking about how the housing crisis has just been getting so much worse, and how they're empty homes that are empty at the same time with developers at the same time where there are people really in desperate need of housing. And the last example here is some Indigenous women in Canada, the tiny house warriors, who have used their idea and sense of home as the land being their home in protest of the pipeline, the transnational pipeline going across Canada, with the tiny homes that are on wheels that they've been building and moving to as blockades to block the pipeline building. So those are an overview of some of the examples that I highlight in the book. And I want to end by just saying that we are in this moment in human history where I think we really need to come together and acknowledge our collective power, and business as usual isn't working. We need a transformative lens to move to a better place and a more prosperous and sustainable future for all. There are lots of ways we can all get involved and act to inspire new leaders. And when we talk about leadership, we're not just talking about elected officials. We are talking about all of us. We can all be leaders in our communities, in our families, in the organizations that we work for, and we need to be advocating for system change and understanding and unlearning the racism and sexism that is so deeply ingrained. Obviously, a few weeks out from the election here in the United States, we need to be focusing on voting, helping others to vote, making sure that that politics of exclusion is not perpetuated. We also really want to be focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion everywhere, advocating for local community renewable energy, and leveraging data, science, and information for the transformative change that we're hoping for, and supporting cooperatives and novel economic structures, and then really connecting across the divide and listening and learning to each other. And in that regard, Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, she has been influential in climate justice internationally, and is really focused on a people's first approach. If we can overcome the divisiveness if we focus on what do people need, what do families need, what investments do our communities need, and move away from the corporate priority that has led to so many of our failed national level policies. And to close, I'll just honor Shirley Chisholm, who was the first Black woman to run for president in 1972. And in some ways, we've come a long way, and in other ways, we really have not come a long way since then. So with that, I would love to open it up for questions and discussion. And I will just mention that the book, all author proceeds from the book will be going to NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice Program. And I hope that this book, inspires the kinds of conversations that we can have today, and also brings some optimism in a time that's really hard for so many people with so much suffering and hardship. And the optimism really comes with the new multiracial, multi-generational coalitions that are forming in response to where we are right now. So thank you all for your time, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Jenny. That was fantastic. And thank you also for your commitment to this issue in the form of sending the proceeds to the NAACP. That's fantastic. We have a couple of questions already for you, and I have a number of questions, but we're going to go to our audience questions first. And the first one actually is from it's not calling up here, but I think I remember it. It's actually from a former student of mine, Kevin Henschhold, who asked the question of you and made the statement, it's not enough to just take renewables online. We need to be shutting down coal plants. And his question was along the lines of, how does the shutting down of the coal industry look? How is that going to, look going forward? And then I would add a part to that question. a second part to that question, which would be, how do we make sure that the communities, the coal impacted communities around these coal plants and in the coal industries, as well as the oil industry that you write about, is protected, is assisted in this transition? So how do we deal with just energy transitions?
Yeah, great questions. And I think our ineffectiveness so far at investing in the communities have been relying on fossil fuels extraction or fossil fuel transport or any phase in the fossil fuel supply chain is part of a big missed opportunity, right? Because fossil fuels, the costs of perpetuating and continuing to rely on fossil fuels, we know the research now shows how expansive those are, and we have not been adequately integrating those costs into our decisions to sustain the system that we have. So yeah, I mean, absolutely. That's the number one thing that we should have been doing for decades, right? Is helping those communities, providing job training and investing in those communities and creating new jobs and new industry and new opportunities. And I think that's a big lost opportunity that we could have been doing for decades, and we didn't. And why we didn't, you could argue it's because of who is in the room, who's making the decisions, and were people thinking with an anti-racist feminist lens of what do communities need. And if it's quite predictable in a sense that there would be resistance, because if you don't offer alternatives and you don't think about what does the community need, then of course you're going to get the community and others on board resisting the change.
Yeah, totally agree. Kevin has an additional question, which is, what do you see as the main impediments at this point to solving the climate crisis, and how do you think we can overcome those impediments?
Well, so those of us who have studied transitions or how big transformation happens in society know the theory of kind of social technical system change. And one thing that's very predictable is that the people who are in power under the old system will want to keep their power, and you should expect and anticipate resistance, right? And that's what we have seen, and some of that resistance has been very effective. And so I think that is the biggest impediment. But for those of us who are academics, we can look at it and say, of course there's resistance. Of course the people who currently have power and are profiting from the fossil fuel system want to continue that and perpetuate that, and they'll do whatever they need to do to try to do that. So I think calling it out for what it is really important. And there's no one approach. I mean, the changes that we're talking about that we really need to effectively synergistically address all of these different issues is big transformative change, right? And that's hard to envision. None of us are very good at knowing how that will happen, but we're in such a disruptive moment right now where we have these intersecting crises that the pandemic has really revealed to everybody the depths of the inequities and disparities that our country has been perpetuating, more so than many other countries. And so I think we are in a moment, again, how big transformative change happens often is big disruptions like the moment we're in now could be an opening.
Thanks for that. So this question, I wish I'd come up with this myself. This is a great one from Sandy Barr, who's deeply involved in our environmental movement here in Arizona and is with the Sierra Club here. She asked, do you think we can achieve energy democracy with monopoly utilities and that particular regulatory structure, or do we need to change that structure too? I appreciate you looking beyond the current technocracy to focus on energy democracy.
we definitely need changes in the regulatory structure because we've seen how it doesn't incentivize the level of change that's needed. And you know, we've been trying to do some community energy projects in different places, and we come back to a lot of the same hurdles over and over, and then the finances don't work, and you know, so yes, I think bigger changes are needed. We can't, you know, in terms of the timing of what needs to change when, really, you know, for big transformative change, again, the theory shows that you need alignment with, you know, macro level policies, then at more local and regional policies and structures and regulations need to adjust to align, and then local policies and practices also have to adjust and align. So it's when you have alignment among at multiple levels that you can see the change happen. So there needs to be, you know, and that's what systemic change is about, right? Like acknowledging that a lot of the things that we thought were kind of set in stone and we thought we couldn't change, or we shouldn't change, or it's impractical to change, or politically impossible to change, you know, there may be openings to actually change things that many people thought couldn't be changed.
So this question is from Chris Boone, who is the Dean of our School of Sustainability. And Chris asks that, and says, there has been a lot of talk about carbon taxes. Can that be retroactive to account for past pollution? If so, how do we make sure it's not regressive?
So, hi, Chris. I know Chris. Good to see you or hear your question. I guess I would characterize carbon taxes as within this technocratic lens that all too often hasn't grappled with the regressiveness that you mentioned, and that is the key question, right? So I think it's, I would say maybe, you know, there could be a role for carbon taxes, but I don't think carbon taxes are going to bring the transformative change that I'm talking about. So I guess I would consider carbon taxes as a, you know, a potential tool in the toolbox, but not the bigger shifts. So I think the bigger shifts are about massive public investments in our communities, not just energy technologies, but in all kinds of areas. You know, an example would be the Green New Deal framework, right? That connects investments in renewable-based future with jobs, potentially connecting. I mean, the Green New Deal is a framework with lots of potential for different policies within, connecting with housing and connecting with health, as well as jobs and economic equity. So carbon tax seems to be kind of connected to the older system, and it's hard to center social justice with thinking as carbon tax as the main tool to be using.
And this is sort of along those lines of large-scale transformation, but one of our attendees has asked you, how does misogyny figure into your vision for a more equitable and sustainable future? Women's resistance is so often dismissed because the resistors are women. Shouldn't gender equity and dignity also be a priority?
Yeah, great question. So yes, they should. And the point that I try to make, and I, you know, suggest that the answer here is anti-racist feminist leadership. People of all genders, all cultural, ethnic, racial, religious backgrounds can embrace anti-racist feminist principles. It's not only women who can be feminists and people of color who can be anti-racist, right? We are coming to terms with that. We are realizing that. So I think what I'm putting forward in the arguments that I'm making here are that we need both. We need everybody to embrace anti-racist feminist principles, no matter who you are. And we also need diversity, which means representation. We need more women, and we need more people of color and indigenous folks in positions of power where they have been historically excluded. When women and people of color and indigenous people come into leadership positions or leadership spaces where they've been historically excluded, they bring very different life experience. They bring different perceptions of risk. They bring different, and I would argue a better appreciation and sensitivity to how to make our policies and make decisions in a way that centers social justice, because they have been living with and dealing with the structural inequities, whether it be gender, race, or others. So that's the argument for why diversity is actually really, really important. We also know from research on innovation, more diverse teams, more diverse communities, more diverse groups, come up with better innovations and think outside the box and think of more different things, and arguably will be more effective in trying to solve whatever it is people are trying to solve. So that's another piece of connecting of why it's both the representation and the diversity and the principles as well.
So thanks, Jenny, for that. So the next couple of questions are kind of a little more focused on the clean energy industry and the sort of industrial transition that we're going to be seeing here. One question is, can you speak more specifically to how you're framing an inclusive approach can be applied to large scale renewable transitions, say like offshore wind, or Arizona utility scale solar, offshore wind being a hot topic in Massachusetts right now?
Yeah, so the energy democracy vision of kind of a heterogeneous mix of renewables includes heterogeneity in scale, right? You could have local, household, individual, community ownership of renewables, and it includes also large scale renewables. I think the question when we think about scale, and especially big, large scale, what we don't want and what we want to actively resist is a few mega energy companies owning, concentrating wealth and power in much the same way the fossil fuel industry has done, and then trying to influence our policies to perpetuate that, and resulting in the same, disparities and inequities and disinvestment in what communities need that we have experienced over the past few decades. So we don't want that. So it's so important when we talk about moving toward a renewable-based future, it matters how we do it. Who benefits, who's included, who's excluded, how are those benefits distributed? Is it going to be just one company owning massive amounts and making profit off of everyone else? Or can we do it in a way, and can we organize it in a way so that those benefits and the ownership and the management and control of those systems is more distributed and locally owned or regionally managed, or some combination there. So I think that's what's really important to think about. I don't know exactly how that happens, but that's the principles that we should be working toward, because all too often our energy policies have a goal of a certain amount of renewables by a certain time, and the subsidies and incentives are put out there, and more privileged people, households, companies take advantage of those, and they're the ones who continue to profit off it. So, and we have to be very careful about that. And so there are ways we could design subsidies to be the reverse. The privileged people are not eligible, right? They can go buy their own solar rooftop just because they want to and they can afford it. Let's focus on low-income communities. How can we get the benefits of households or rooftop solar, you know, to low-income communities. It's a totally different way of thinking. It's not the way we've been doing it, but we're realizing that unless we start thinking differently, we're going to continue to perpetuate the disparities that we've seen.
Yeah, and I think that kind of goes to another question we got from Greer at the Colorado School of Mines, the Payne Institute, who asked the question. She said Greer said there's a tension between focusing on women-focused economic recovery from the she session and a green climate-focused recovery, which might favor male-dominated sectors like infrastructure development. How can we think creatively about putting women at the center of the green recovery and the energy transition so that these two versions of recovery are not at odds? And then I would add to that, that does strike me as being part of the problem here, right? Which is we know we have so much work to do, you know, in terms of addressing climate change. And yet we also want to accomplish all the goals that you lined up for us today. So, and is it possible to do all of them at the same time? I think you are arguing that you can do all of them at the same time.
I'm actually arguing that we cannot effectively make the changes we need for climate change unless and until we deal with the others, because we're going to keep coming up against the same problem. So yes, I think it's the synergies and the intersectionality of all of this that actually gives us the best hope. And you know, the conventional view in environmental climate experts is like, oh, I'm a climate expert, so I focus on carbon, decarbonization, and that's all I focus on. And the other stuff, like whatever happens socially, doesn't matter. You know, I know many experts who you know, kind of have that lens and think that they know the answer, and that if only everyone else knew everything that they knew, they might be able to figure this out, and the problem would be solved. And I think there's an arrogance to that, like very technocratic perspective, and it's definitely missing a lot of things that inevitably and very predictably are coming up to, that are the reasons why some of those visions haven't happened, right? So I think I do think it is the connections. And so even with the green recovery and the she session, and I think adding in the racial disparities and the movement for Black lives, that is, you know, revealing or elevating just an unacceptable level of disinvestment and lost opportunity for so many people for so many decades, that again, that also needs to be centered as with the green recovery. And again, I think that's why I've anchored both anti-racist and feminist leadership as priorities, and we really need to be paying attention to both at the same time. And it's not one or the other, or the climate priority over the others. I think we really need all in order to be effective and inclusive.
Terrific. Thanks, Jenny. This question is from Tracy Stafford, who asks, as a Black woman, it is challenging to be in the sustainability space without addressing the bias built into our systems. How do we change the culture?
Yeah, great question. I think I think talking about it more and more, and elevating how, and revealing how the biases and the systemic exclusion has been perpetuated for so long is necessary. And I think you know, our policies really reflect our values, and also our budgets in terms of, you know, I was actually just on a panel yesterday that was discussing these interconnectedness of these different ideas. And I think it's really important for us to hold people accountable when we see the bias and the systemic challenges. It's very hard because, and this is also where we all need allies, so that it's not only the Black folks who are calling out the racial biases, and it's not only the women who are calling out the gendered biases, and I think that's where we, for too long, too many of us have been or continue to be complacent about how even subtle ways that we do things and ways that we elevate certain voices, certain priorities is very, we're missing out on so much, and it's we need to focus on that and change it as we can.
Yeah, I think you and I have probably both been on way too many all white and mostly male panels in the energy industry or the energy space. It certainly happens all the time.
Yeah,
so that's
they're often called, sometimes they're called a manel.
A manel,
instead of
right.
a panel.
That's the bare minimum that has to change.
Oh yeah, someone just mentioned that on the chat. Yeah.
Here's a very interesting question as well from Jennifer Smith Izzo, who asks, with Trump selecting a woman to take the Supreme Court seat, is this a move, in your opinion, to look more inclusive or feminist in current leadership? Do you think this selection will work towards your idea of change in systems and overall justice?
So the current nominee, I don't think, I would not consider a feminist. And this gets to the point I made earlier. Your self-identity does not necessarily, doesn't mean you stand up for certain principles of race or gender or feminism or anti-racism. So I think I mean, clearly there's some acknowledgement of the value of gender diversity, I think, with that pick. But that doesn't mean that obviously that the principles that the nominee will bring are aligned with feminist principles. So I think it's you know, there's a lot about that whole process, and that's very problematic.
So this question, if I can get back to it, has to do with investment. Well, let's see if I can get back to it here. Let me go to a question that I had, if I could take the moderator's license here, which is you talk in your book a little bit about climate gentrification. So I wondered if you could elaborate on that for the audience. What do you mean by climate gentrification, and how should we go about addressing it?
Yeah, so there are a few ways that I think ways to think about climate gentrification. One is, I guess a primary thing is thinking about the climate impacts and disruptions and challenges that we're all facing in terms of changes to our climate system, and it relates to those who are more privileged, have more resources, are better able to adapt and, you know, move to more higher level places that are prone to flooding, for example, and or you know, able to air condition with extreme heat, whereas others are not. And those are some examples of the kinds of things that are referred to with climate gentrification. Often gentrification particularly relates to the value of property and you know, moving people out of or people being forced to move out of their homes to let more wealthy people coming in, and that's happening, you know, as an example, I've heard in Miami, where sea level is encroaching and the ocean is encroaching. the higher neighborhoods that are higher up on the hill used to be poor neighborhoods, but now people are realizing, oh, these are actually going to be better in the future. So real estate is picking up in those areas, and the people who used to live there are getting pushed out. So there's a very tangible example of climate gentrification.
Excellent, thank you. And Matt Fegan has asked, can you comment on the challenges of co-optation and silencing? The big transformation you're calling for seems to require broad-based and large-scale mobilizing, but a lot of people either feel silenced or they're benefiting from the status quo enough to silence themselves. So what do we need to do to support so many more people breaking out of their current everyday norms? I feel that even if many people would agree with your points in principle, can you offer lessons learned from the key people you've documented about the key practices of widespread mobilization?
Yeah, great question. And I think I would point people to the Sunrise Movement right now and the youth who are really looking at the future, and it does not look good, right? There's just the climate crisis, but economic options and we have an intergenerational justice issue here, where a lot of older people just want to get through the rest of their life as easy as they can and leave the problems to the young people, and yet it's the older people who have more of the power. So I think, and that relates to this issue of kind of complacency and a sense that what can we do? How can we get involved? And I think that I have felt just in the past 6 months with the pandemic, a sense of agency among people that is different and new, and people are realizing that you can't assume or take for granted anything in terms of leadership and in terms of anybody really kind of protecting us from really bad things that could happen. Like the pandemic, obviously the United States has invested the most in science and health, medicine research. We knew that a pandemic would come. We should have been ready and prepared, yet we are the country in the world that is now faring the worst. And people are seeing that and realizing that, like, why is that? I think we're in a time where people are realizing some things that they haven't before, and then obviously it's hard to get involved, especially with restrictions on convening and concerns about in-person interactions. But there's a lot really happening in terms of this coalition building that I mentioned, and there are ways for all of us to get involved and engage locally, and our elected officials and other leaders in our communities are really want us to get involved, and they want our feedback. And so I think everyone really can step up and be creative about new things, and people also have, we're all adjusting to different lifestyle right now still. And so we can try new things. We may not have been politically engaged before. Maybe now is the time. And I think a lot of people that I know, at least, are feeling that. And our students definitely. I mean, if you think about this, the students, this semester versus even a few semesters ago or a few years ago, some of these issues would have seemed kind of off, a little out of the mainstream, but they're becoming more and more in the mainstream and what people are thinking about, and people are looking for ways to get involved.
Excellent. Well, I think, Lauren, if I'm correct, we are almost out of time. And I want to take this opportunity, Jenny, that's a fantastic presentation. Really essential information. I hope everyone has the chance to download Jennie Stephens' book. Again, the book is entitled Diversifying Power, Why We Need Antiracist Feminist Leadership on Climate and Energy. it's a must reading for anybody in the energy space, and maybe a whole lot of people not even in the energy space. So thank you, Jennie, so much for your contribution to the clean energy space, and to literature, and to scholarship, and for being with us here today. I think I'm supposed to turn it back over to Lauren, if I'm not mistaken.
Sure. Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to listen to both of you. Chris Mays, you know, you're such a hero to me and to so many in Arizona. And Dr. Stephens, it's just your reputation precedes you. Thank you so much. We're so pleased to kick off the Island Press series with your talk. And we're looking forward to future talks. And Shalonda Baker is going to speak on her book, Revolutionary Power, An Activist Guide to the Energy Transition. That's on November 19th. And Chris Mays is also going to moderate that discussion. So thank you very much. And we're also bringing Jackie Patterson in as well in December. So pleased to see you highlight her and her activism. Thank you. Thank you everyone for attending. And the broadcast will be on our YouTube site.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.